Hello there. For today's bonus content, we've got the first interview that Ruth and I ever recorded together, which was actually the first time we ever met in person. Her dad, Doug Serven, joined us very briefly at the beginning of the call, but then he had to jump off. This interview was originally supposed to be a part of last week's actual episode, but it started getting too long and we had to cut something. So today you're getting episode-worthy content that got bumped. But actually, it kind of worked out because this conversation is a pretty good bridge between the themes we talked about last week and the broader dynamics of the PCA that we'll be discussing next week. Not only will you finally get to hear more about Ruth and her background, you're going to get some insights into how Ruth and I both personally feel about this project and some of the resistance that we've received to it. Going back years before anything was ever researched, let alone recorded, I always had a vision that this series would run on the parallel tracks I talked about in episode 1. We're not just telling a story, we're telling the story of trying to tell the story. And Ruth and I are both a part of that. So today you're getting a behind-the-scenes peek into our thought process and personal feelings. Also, keep in mind that this was recorded last June. I had done several key interviews already, but the research side was pretty lacking. We didn't have access to any of the police files yet, which Ruth was instrumental in getting a hold of. So you're going to hear Ruth talking about things that she's interested in tracking down, which we eventually did. So with that, I bring you Ruth Serven Smith.
I am a journalist. I live in Birmingham, Alabama, with my husband, Adam. He is in school, which is why we live there. I went to school for journalism, University of Missouri. People can't see it, but I'm wearing my Mizzou journalism shirt.
In the footsteps of your father, right?
Well, yes, but I think I didn't really know I wanted to do journalism when I started school there and fell in love with it. And then have worked in newspapers and media since college. I currently edit an education team that covers K-12 education in Alabama. So that's my day job.
And how did you first learn about the Elizabeth Macintosh case?
I first remember hearing about it about a year ago, and Dad told me, I think he had been pretty well interested in it for a long time, and then it came up that he was interested in this murder case in St. Louis at his seminary. At the time, he was thinking about writing a screenplay, and I wasn't very interested in it. I live in Birmingham, Alabama. There are lots of homicides every year. There's lots of murders in St. Louis every year. Obviously, all of those deserve more attention than they get, but it wasn't really clear to me why this one especially needed attention, other than that it happened to have a personal connection to his seminary. All that to say, I was not very interested. I kind of blew him off. And then he kept talking about it, like as we would see each other over the next few months. And I think at some point, pretty recently, he said, well, I've got this guy named TJ who's helping me make a podcast. I said, oh, interesting. Like, we're still on this murder. Like, what's so important about this murder to you? And he, of course, he was telling me why he cared and why it was interesting. And I remember the thing that made me personally interested in it was the piece of information. I don't remember that I'd heard this before, that she was a student. Like, for some reason, the first time I heard this talked about, I heard Elizabeth Macintosh, cleaning lady, killed in the bathroom at seminary. And so that's obviously awful and horrible by itself. But it did not stick in my head that she was a student. And so immediately, I'm an education journalist. My interest went way up because institutions have a duty of care to their students. And so then I started finally asking more questions and got interested for a variety of reasons, but got interested myself, and here we are.
So, Doug, you kind of brought Ruth in here. So why is Ruth sitting with us today?
Well, we needed a female, I think, and Brittany worked with us for a time, but then I was brainstorming with her about who would be possible other women who might be interested. And she suggested Ruth. And I definitely remembered being blown off previously. But the reason why I was blown off really was because I was trying to write this boring, meandering movie about myself. And it included some of this stuff. So that she wasn't wrong to not be particularly interested in that. So, but she picked back up, and then I was like, oh yeah, we could have an actual journalist. I just pretend to be a journalist. And then Ruth, like, all of a sudden had all of these just instantaneous questions and insight, sort of as a newcomer to the case and a sort of insider, outsider. And so I think it was perfect. And then we get to work together on something as cool, even though the reason is awful.
Okay, so do you want to just tell us what is your impression of the case? Maybe just, put your journalist hat on, and what are the things we need to be thinking about going forward, where we're at, what we need to do, who we should talk to.
Okay. This is an unusual spot for me to be in. Normally I'm doing the work and then showing my notes, not reacting to it. So I will say what I can. I'm always a little hesitant to share my own personal opinion just because that feels uncomfortable to me in my job as a journalist, but we'll see where we get. Also, please correct me. I don't have my notes in front of me. So Dad told me about this murder that happened in 1990 at Covenant Seminary in Creve Coeur, Missouri. That is unusual because not a lot of homicides happen in Creve Coeur, Missouri. For anybody who does not know St. Louis, little universe world, the county is, typically considered safer, right? St. Louis City, typically considered more dangerous. I was looking up recently, too, some recent, crime stats for Creve Coeur. Not a lot, relatively. And so it's unusual to have a murder. It's really unusual to have an unsolved murder. Typically, I think you heard this from a police voice you spoke to. Typically, it's pretty obvious pretty quickly, right? Whether a murder has an obvious or a homicide has an obvious suspect or not. Lots of times they're domestic. You can narrow that down pretty quickly. Or it's somebody knows, right? Somebody has a fight, somebody has a drug issue, road rage, who knows. And so the police can kind of just naturally start to narrow things down pretty quickly. It is unusual to have an unsolved murder after 30 years in a place where there would be high interest in solving it. And so that kind of leads us down the path of why didn't this get solved? My guess at the moment is that somebody does know something useful and either has never shared that information before or did share it and it got lost or suppressed. I don't believe that no one in the world knows what happened to Elizabeth Macintosh. That's incredibly hard to imagine. Somebody knows something helpful, and for whatever reason, that information has not been taken down the path of justice. So I'm interested in that. I'm just naturally interested in helping bring that information to light. My impressions, I guess, is that there seem to have been 2 investigations done relatively quickly. One by the police, one by the seminary. It's understandable why we don't have all the details of what happened there. It's pretty typical, of course, that people wouldn't want to share stuff that they thought was confidential or not relevant. But it seems like just from, again, the pretty recent time I've been asking, reading your notes and talking to some people about this issue, is everybody has a different story about what happened. And that also, to me, says that there's no comprehensive narrative that's been publicly shared. People are relying on hearsay and old memories and maybe false memories or false stories. And that also makes finding out the truth and getting justice way harder. So my interest as a journalist is not to just stir stuff up for no purpose. My interest is to create a comprehensive record that's the best details and clearest facts that we have to this point, put it all together so that people can compare notes, and then maybe actually move this forward.
One interesting thing that I've run into over and over and over again, trying to get people to talk for this case, for what we're doing, people say some variation on, I don't really have anything useful to contribute. There's nothing that I can add. There's nothing helpful that I can give you. And I want to tell these people, I'm asking you for a reason. I'll determine if what you have to say is helpful or not, because there's been a couple instances where what people have said is very helpful and very useful. Is that something that you run into often in your journalism experience?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, people normally fall into two camps. Either people feel like I have something I've been trying to tell somebody for years and years and years, and nobody's listened to me. I love talking to those people. Then there's also the people who you think will help fill in like factual gaps or even just impressions. And you don't know for sure, but it's important to ask. And then to your point too, lots of times people will remember something. It might be an impression of seeing someone else, or what time you did something in the day, or, oh, I noticed this person was acting a little strange. And maybe you can't do something with that, but I do think it's important to ask. Basically, I only ever know things in the world when people choose to tell me. I would always rather hear from someone else than make an assumption. The last thing I want to do is assume something and later find out that that's not true. And so that's why we ask, right? And if somebody doesn't want to talk, that's okay. A lot of this stuff is pretty traumatic. It's understandable why people don't necessarily want to drag it all up. But I mean, the basic duty of journalism is to say that you did ask and make an effort and then go from there.
What's been your personal experience as a woman in the PCA?
Here we go. Yeah, my dad was a pastor. So I grew up in church, youth group. I went to a Christian school. What do you guys call it? PCA world? What's the other world? Real world? I was very into PCA world, I would say, until college. And two things that happened in college were Ferguson in 2014 and the Mizzou protests in 2015, which I covered as a journalist. And in the space of about a year, I was like, PCA world does not like this stuff. And PCA world does not know what to deal with this stuff. Like specifically PCA world, because one of my pastors at the time was telling me conspiracy theories about the Ferguson protests. And I was like, okay, but like, that's not true. So what else is like up for question? So, you know, nothing super malicious, but I started to kind of become my own person and have my own thoughts, and had a great pastor in college who encouraged me to ask questions. And my relationship to the PCA is that I am a reluctant participant in PCA world.
Do you still go to a PCA church?
See, normally I wouldn't answer that question, but I feel like for the purpose of this podcast, I should. Yes, I go to a PCA church. Every time I move, I try to find a different church. And I tell people I keep finding good pastors who are unfortunately part of the PCA. So, yeah.
Just going back to that stuff from 2014, 2015, sort of those kinds of issues, or have there been other issues that have come out in PCA world that you've have concerns about? You can also say no comment. That's fine.
No, I'm thinking about it. I'm happy to talk about it. I don't have any reason not to talk about it. It's more just like, it's my own personal faith. And I guess what I would say is I am very committed to my faith, but I don't know that the PCA as an organization has done a lot to earn my trust and respect. I love my dad. I think he's a great pastor. He chooses to be a PCA pastor. That's totally fine with me. I have no issue with that. But when I look at the bigger picture, I actually follow kind of what the denomination does relatively closely, because politics is interesting to me. But when I think about an organization founded in the 70s after massive resistance to desegregation that refuses to talk about that and kind of created a parallel political structure in a lot of cities in the South and schools and organizations that supported segregated society and patriarchal society. And then, as far as I know, never really rethought that. I have huge concerns. That's bad. And then I will also add in, as a woman, the intense resistance to hearing questions and concerns and objections from women is concerning, and the reaction to the 2015 Obergefell decision, intensely concerning. You add all of that up, it's kind of hard to be a 20-year-old in this church right now. So I think it's just a smaller and smaller group of people, and they're not really up to date with a lot of stuff right now.
GA starts tomorrow. You want to go down there?
No, I really don't.
Just a quick note. GA is General Assembly, the annual PCA business meeting. According to the GA website, quote, "Our pastors and church leaders gather to study, discuss, debate, and decide biblical and ministry issues. Visitors are welcome to observe the proceedings and may sit in the visitor section of the assembly hall." Unquote.
I don't know if Dad knew this. I've watched the live stream of GA for a few years because I was kind of just, again, like interested. There would be like kind of interesting debates and discussions going on. Last year, too, one of my old pastors, Tim LaCroix, was presenting on an issue I cared about. There was a report on how to like better address and limit sexual abuse and domestic violence in the church. I thought that was great. I thought Tim did a great job. I watched that. In a few previous years, I watched some of the debate around the Nashville statement about...
Is this like the Greg Johnson stuff?
Yeah, Greg Johnson and can gay pastors be pastors? And then it kind of spiraled into, can gay people be in the church and trans people be in the church? And I watched some of that discussion and like cried in bed because it was incredibly nasty. So that's my recent feelings.
I guess I'm just trying to tie that to, I mean, a lot of what you're saying, you know, intense resistance to this kind of stuff. And can you just swing that a little bit closer to you? Just pull. Yep, there you go. We're getting a lot of resistance, at least from Covenant, which is part of the PCA, in terms of what we're doing. And so this whole idea of resistant to change and unwillingness to listen to other opinions and hear people out. You know, I'm not part of the PCA, but that has been my experience so far, at least dealing with Covenant. So it checks out.
How I would tie this in is Elizabeth Macintosh was a female student at a seminary that was focused possibly entirely on giving men theological training. So obviously they were interested in giving some women some theological training. That's great. But it does not seem like she was part of a formal degree program of giving women a pathway into ministry. And the reaction after her death, to me, seems a little bit similar of this person was a little bit of an afterthought in this group. And I would say that kind of carries forward. I'm not saying it's intentional discrimination. I'm not saying it's intentionally ignoring women on campus. But when you add all of that up with some of the other concerning things that seem to be happening on campus around domestic violence, it just seems like people didn't really know what to do with the women at Covenant Seminary at that point. And there was no formal way for them to express concerns or ask questions or raise issues if there was. I'm happy to be corrected if you guys have found otherwise.
I wouldn't say. I mean, I think Jerem Bars would say he personally cared about her and gave her a voice, but
I'm sure individual people did. And so it's kind of hard to phrase this feeling.
There's a difference between what one individual does versus the institution taken as a whole.
I think so. Again, I'm relying on my training as an education journalist a little bit here. Like, I'm used to working with schools that have formal Title IX structures, right? Which was a very recent invention. This would not have been something that anybody in 1990 was thinking about. Where if something happens to you that impacts your educational environment, you can go make a complaint. Does that always work? Of course not. But there's structures, you know what I'm saying? And people have a vocabulary of saying, hey, my male supervisor is treating me super weird. Or, hey, I'm getting these weird messages from someone and it's making it really hard to concentrate. Or, hey, one of my classmates reported this really concerning situation at home. Like, what do I do about that? Can somebody help me report that to the police? It just seems like nobody, I don't know. Did anybody know what to do with those situations at the time? I'm not sure. One thing I'll just say from a journalist perspective is it's always hard when you're just speculating about what I would have done or what I wish someone would have done. It's always the most helpful to be able to compare it to like a policy. And so one of the questions I had when I started looking at this case was, did Covenant Seminary have a policy of background checks for people that came on campus and lived among kids? It doesn't seem like it. That's not unusual for 1990s. It was like hard to run background checks back then. But I think they have a policy now where employees have to be checked, which is good. Another question I had is, if there is a complaint of domestic violence or abuse of some level, is that an automatic reason to be kicked off of campus? I don't know. For purposes of a podcast, though, I'll just say that it's possible we'll find something that does not seem like it needs to be publicly released, right? Like, you know, if somebody totally unconnected to all of this has something in their divorce papers, for example, about an incident that happened 5 years ago, I would be pretty uncomfortable releasing that. So all that to say, you know, we can clean this up in post-production, but just guessing, so people know, what I have looked for so far are court records of various people who are on campus at the time. There were some people mentioned in the Oxygen documentary having criminal histories. I think everybody needs a full check to see if anything else comes up. The issue with some of those records is that lots of family court records and lots of things to do with like sexual abuse or child abuse are kept sealed, understandably, because you don't want everyone in the world to know who those victims were. And so it's possible that someone will have something pop up and we won't really be able to fully tell what the complaint was and what happened in this situation. So, for example, we're talking kind of generally about a domestic violence incident. You're right. Like, I do want to know if that was reported to the Creve Coeur police, if anybody showed up and responded to a call, if that was ever logged in a divorce proceeding, and if that ever resulted in a criminal charge and conviction. I'm just saying, like, we might not really be able to get a definitive answer to those things. So, yeah, I'm always interested in comparing people's recollections and memories as against a paper trail. That helps match things up and kind of clear out some of the noise and false memories and lies as much as possible. It's not perfect, but we'll see what we find. Hey, I want to go back some of the stuff we were talking about. I guess I was just wanting to add that my brain dump of things I dislike about the PCA is not necessarily all of the things I think about the PCA. So, noting that for the record.
Meaning there's other positive things you do like about the PCA, or there are other negative things that you're not going to talk about here? Or both?
Both. But yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty of great people doing good things that are connected to the denomination. And I'm not interested in being part of a takedown of the denomination. I think it will or won't survive without me. But I think this podcast is bigger, right, than taking something down or building something up. It's about actually finding justice for a person.
Yeah, we're not trying to do a hit job on anyone, on any specific person,
right?
On the PCA, on the Creve Coeur Police Department.
Correct.
But we are trying to tell the truth.
Yes.
And some of those truths are going to make some people look bad. And so just because we want to speak certain truths, I think in some people's minds that gets conflated to, oh, you're trying to bring us down, or you're trying to make somebody look bad. Well, it's not my fault that the truth makes people look bad. And I think this story, you were talking earlier about how there's no cohesive narrative around this story. And I think that's at least partially because a cohesive narrative is going to make a lot of people look bad. Well,
I think it's easier to not talk about things than to talk about them.
Yeah, what I'm not saying, I've said this 1,000 times to everybody I've talked to, I'm not saying that there's like a cabal of people who put on black robes and they meet in a dark room and they conspire to suppress the story. And who do we need to get to make sure the truth doesn't come out? But something like that doesn't have to happen for there to be a cultural, institutional momentum towards, we don't talk about this. We don't ask these kinds of questions. We don't mention this person's name. So we talked to someone who was, let's say they were involved in the covenant administration. And in terms of their involvement and their relation to this case, there were things that in hindsight that they wished that they had done differently. But part of why they didn't do those things differently is because things had always been done a certain way. And so they were just kind of like, well, it feels like we should be doing these things, but we've never done them, so I guess we just don't do those things here. And that continues institutionally down through the generations of people who are in charge. So it doesn't have to be a cabal and a conspiracy for there to be an institutional pressure to not talk about this thing.
Yeah, so on the record, I would say this story to me is a great example of institutional inertia. It is very easy to keep doing the same thing that everyone has always done. And people might make an effort too, right? To find out the truth, to do an investigation, to maybe restart and talk to some people. But then it becomes very easy to stop. Or you realize you get a little bit of pushback and you're like, I might not really be committed to following this all the way through. That's a very human response, right? And it's a very institutional response. Institutions are designed to protect themselves. I don't think it's necessarily a conspiracy, but the easiest thing is for nothing to happen.
And one of the things, and this is, a gripe that I have about the larger institution of American evangelical Christianity, but the thing that is so frustrating and the thing that has really been part of my, we'll call it faith deconstruction journey. I have a video series you can watch about this if you'd like more information. But these should be the people. Okay, you say it's a natural human tendency.
I can talk about this all day.
These are the people. If anyone on planet Earth should be doing things differently, doing hard things that maybe are even against their own interest, but this is the right thing to do, these are the goddamn people who should be doing it. And they're just like everybody else. You think the people who claim to be indwelt with the literal metaphysical creator of the universe would have something different about the way that they operate in the world, and they don't.
Yeah.
And rant.
No, I'm thinking about which of my 5 rants about this topic I'm feeling like going on right now. Is this a cussing podcast?
I haven't.
You
probably.
Just cussed.
No, I don't think I'm going to. This is just for us. I'm not going to use any of that.
I think something like that needs to be in the final cut, because you're exactly right. I think Christians, out of all people, should be able to explain good and evil and be interested in the course of justice. And it's easy to say from the outside, right, that you did the wrong thing and why didn't you do this? But you're right. Evangelical Christianity is just as interested as any other group of people of protecting its own. And pushing against that is very hard. That's why a lot of people are pretty mad at the church right now, right? And so there are certainly people on the inside pushing against that and trying to do the right thing. I guess we can have our own opinions of whether that's a majority or a minority. But yeah, this is a perfect case of the church. I'm always very hesitant to say, like, the church should do the right thing or this person or that person should do the right thing, because I don't think it's as easy as saying that they did the wrong thing. I don't feel like I have all the answers about this case yet to make that kind of conclusion.
There's a lot of smoke. Maybe we don't have the fire yet, but there's a whole lot of smoke.
I'm concerned about why so many people don't want to talk about it. So here's what, like, I feel like we've talked around this, but here's what I really wanted to drive home when I was talking to you is, you know, statistically, we know that a lot of people in their lives will be victims of sexual assault and or domestic violence. But the number of people accused of concerning behavior on this individual campus is high. I almost, it's not that I can't believe it, it's that I can believe it. I'm incredibly concerned. And the fact that it's unclear if anything was done about it, and that some of these people later went on to be pastors, is incredibly concerning. You know, we can talk all we want about whether the PCA has good theology or bad theology, but at the end of the day, it's about how you treat the actual people in your care. And the fact that people are possibly being ordained to ministry when there have been complaints about how they treat their wives and kids and fellow students is incredibly concerning to me. And if anybody takes anything from this project, I want them to take that home and think about that. And like really think about, do I know what is going on in my own church? And would I know what to do if I see any red flags? At the end of the day, murder is awful, but there are so many other awful things in this story. I don't know if all of them are true. I don't know if all of them are still issues, but the fact that anybody had to listen to their mom possibly getting beaten up at seminary, like that would just destroy your whole sense of trust in anything related to the church. I can't even believe it.